We have a really special and very exciting roundtable discussion for you with some truly great voices. And to introduce that roundtable discussion is Dr. Yvonne Goldsberry from the Endowment for Health. Yvonne?
Good morning, or it's late morning, actually, by now, everyone. At the Endowment for Health, we envision a New Hampshire where all children are ready to enter kindergarten. When they enter kindergarten, they're ready to be successful. And by all children, we mean the kids that you just saw from the East Side Center. We also mean the children that live up in Coos County who may be eligible for free and reduced lunch. We mean the children of new immigrants that may live in Nashua, Manchester, Concord, or Laconia. We mean the majority of the Hispanic children that live in our state that by the time they get to 4th grade, they're not reading at grade level. And we also mean the kids that live on my street, the Monadnock region, that might otherwise be called average. So we mean all of the children in New Hampshire. And at the Endowment, we share with you a deep understanding and commitment to the need to invest in our children because all kids are a promise and a possibility. The economic future of New Hampshire depends on our ability to raise the next generation to be skilled, innovative workers who can adapt to a changing world. And smart policy investments in young children will result in healthy, learning, and thriving families. So the next part of today's program is about solutions. So we're going to hear about solutions for today and tomorrow. And it's great pleasure for me to introduce the moderator of this session, Cokie Roberts. Ms. Roberts is a political commentator for ABC News and also contributes political analysis for National Public Radio. And thank you, Cokie, because I listen to you all the time. In her more than 40 years in broadcasting, she's won countless awards, including 3 Emmys. She was cited by the American Women in Radio and Television as one of the 50 greatest women in the history of broadcasting. Her #1 bestseller, We Are Our Mother's Daughters, is an account of women's roles and relationships throughout American history. Ms. Roberts also sits on the board of Save the Children. Would you please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Cokie Roberts.
Well, thank you. Mark and Kevin, why don't you come on up? I, of course, didn't know this picture was going to be here. And as you can see from the Capitol being there, it was a campaign picture, right? My father was in Congress at the time, but running for governor of Louisiana. I'm thrilled to tell you he lost. But the reason that we were all trotted out was for campaign purposes. And my parents, because of being in politics, were away a good bit. And in fact, they were away for a period of time, not long after World War II. And they went to Europe, and you had to go by ship. And I was 4 years old, and it was before people went to pre-K, but I did. I went and enrolled myself in school. And I didn't have to cross any streets. That was the important thing. And so when my parents got home, they found me in school. And we used to switch schools at half year. We'd spend half year in New Orleans and half year in Washington school. And so when my mother went to pay, the woman who ran the school said, actually, my mother had not enrolled me in the school, that I had enrolled myself. And so she couldn't pay, and my poor mother, for the rest of Miss Aiken's life, had to find something nice to send her for Christmas. But it was the beginning of my commitment to early childhood education. And it's been there ever since, as it is for these gentlemen. Mark Shriver, who's over there, is the head of the Save the Children Action Network. Mark created what we call now SCAN, because as the head of Save the Children U.S. programs, which are very much involved with really 0 to 3 and then early childhood education and literacy in schools. He realized that the programs were wonderful and did great work, but that they needed advocacy to have them get funded and to be able to get to scale in a variety of places. So he created the Save the Children Action Network and has been very involved here in New Hampshire for the last several months, working with WMUR, having a conversation with the candidate on a weekly basis for a while there, right? Yeah. And Kevin Madden, many of you have probably seen on TV over the years. Kevin is at the Hamilton Place Strategy Groups, and he has been working on public policy issues and advocacy in a variety of ways. But Kevin is also an expert in crisis management, which has served him well as someone who's represented people in both the private and public sector. You probably saw his face as a spokesman for Mitt Romney, both in 2012 and in 2008. Which leads me, Kevin, to the question, what is a nice Republican boy like you doing in a place like this?
Well, it was interesting when I checked in at the hotel last night. They were like, "So have you stayed here before?"
Right.
I was like, "Well, 3 presidential campaigns. I've probably stayed in every room in this hotel."
Right.
But,
We
well,
all
you know,
have.
I got very involved in this issue because I did see, you know, my experiences from having worked on both congressional campaigns and having worked on presidential campaigns is that oftentimes Republicans lose an ability to talk about issues from a value standpoint, and oftentimes only talk about issues from a dollars and cents standpoint. And you know, too oftentimes they're thinking, well, how is this going to look like? What's this issue going to look like through the lens of the Wall Street Journal editorial page? Which, while an important intellectual experiment, oftentimes loses the fact that, for example, on healthcare, nobody ever sat and got a diagnosis from their doctor and said, well, gee, I wonder what my free market values are or how they're going to help me through this process. And so I looked at the issue of education as a key way to talk to voters through this value-centric framework. And particularly with early childhood education, early learning, I saw it as an important way to talk about that economic opportunity, and that we hear it now from Jeb Bush and Paul Ryan and others, the right to rise. How is it that we build a stronger, better future, provide more opportunity, provide a stronger economies, stronger children who can contribute to economies? And how do we do that? And I found early childhood education was a key issue and a key way to start making that argument to many voters.
But we don't hear it in the political dialogue very often. And Mark, that's something that you've been trying to change.
Absolutely, Koki, and thank you for being the moderator of this, and thank you all very much for coming today. It's great to be on a panel with Kevin. I think this is a bipartisan issue. We've seen it, leadership on a state level, as Kevin mentioned. We see it in places as diverse as Michigan. We see it in Alabama. We see it in Oklahoma. Not exactly blue, hardcore Democratic states. What we don't see is that leadership in Washington on a consistent basis. There's a lot of talk about it, but for one reason or another, and Senator Shaheen and I were just talking about this, we really need to really talk about and stress the accountability of our federal leaders on both the presidential level and on the congressional level to take steps. You know, I come from a political family, and Koki does as well. Kevin's obviously been around politics for a long, long time. And I was in the state legislature. It's easy to nod your head and say, yes, kids are our most important resource, or they're one of the most important resources. And then when push comes to shove, not put the investment into kids. Because kids don't have a PAC, they don't vote, and in many cases, the kids that are struggling the most, poor kids, their parents don't give money, and the parents don't vote. So this is the easiest group to ignore. And that's why we started Save the Children Action Network, and we've worked with Kevin and with others talking about, not just talking about the issue, but as Koki mentioned, sponsoring here in Manchester, the conversations with the candidates to reach across the aisle and to ask questions of folks as diverse as Governor Bush, Marco Rubio,
And how have those gone, Mark? How have those conversations gone?
I think you see leadership coming from different angles, Koki, Secretary Clinton, who you'll hear from this afternoon, has spoken about this issue for a number of years. Governor Bush has made an investment in Florida on early childhood education. The quality is not that good, but the access is there. So we need to stress in conversations with people like Governor Bush and with Secretary Clinton and Governor O'Malley, both Democrats and Republicans, that we need high quality services and we will not wait. Kevin's heard me say this, and I can't remember whether you think this is a great idea or a lousy idea, but what we really need is we need the NRA for kids. And people say it's a terrible analogy, but the bottom line is that you have to respect the fact that the NRA has an issue, they believe passionately about it, and they get people committed to it. And there's a nice population here right now, but I guess I'd ask you, who's given money based solely on their state or federal elected officials' stance on early education in this room? 1, 2, 3. You don't count, Dr. Kuhl. You're from Washington State, so you're out. So there's 3 of us. I don't know what your reaction is.
You make a very important point. And where we have seen success at the candidate level, whether it's been, and Mark's organization has been very good, not just looking at presidential candidates, but looking in all these battleground states at some of the lower, some of the down ballot races. But where we have seen success is when we personalize and localize these issues and our involvement and how important it is to those communities. And that's something that we're doing right now with the presidential candidates, is reminding people and elevating so many of the voices from the ground up in states about this issue. And then also reminding them and supporting them when they have had issues or success or progress on the early childhood education issue in their states. For example, we saw with Governor Bush, there's a long record of early childhood education initiatives that are successful in Florida. Doing so the same with Marco Rubio, who's also from Florida, or pointing out that there are candidates that are bedrock conservatives in places like Indiana or Tennessee that are promoting this, South Dakota. It's not just a blue state issue. So when we do that, when we personalize and localize it, it's important. But the other thing is, too, when we see this with folks like the Bezos Foundation and their support for an early learning network, is making sure that these best practices and that communities that are active are talking to each other, and that we create this early learning nation, this early learning network of advocates that are organized like any other political campaign to talk to each other and to hold their candidates and policymakers accountable. That's where we've made strong success in the last few years.
Well, actually, I was just last week in Kentucky with Save the Children, looking at some of our programs in Appalachia, and the politicians who showed up were all Republicans, and including the president of the Senate, who says that annually the House takes Save the Children out of the budget, and annually he puts it back in, and he says, I don't know what their problem is, because, really, when I'm putting something in that says, Save the Children, it kind of works for me.
And we have, in some of these areas, we have seen like a policy arms race, in the sense that Republicans and Democrats are racing to take credit for their support of early childhood education programs and their success.
But not enough, and that's Mark's point. But,
right.
But you started, Kevin, by talking about the values aspect of it. But there is also a financial aspect of it. I mean, we know that a quality early childhood program saves a lot of money.
Absolutely, and that's where I think sometimes I do encounter a lot of skepticism, and I do get this, are you sure you're a Republican, and how did you end up working on this issue? I think that helps address some of the skepticism of my friends that we engage amongst center-right audiences. I talk to them about the importance of showing this value-centric economic platform, but also it's very consistent, and that's what we've seen with some of these governors who have implemented these programs in states, and Republican governors who have advanced this. They recognize the dollars and cents on it. They recognize that it is much easier and it is to our advantage to help educate young children and build strong children than it is to try and fix a broken man or a broken woman on the other end of the equation. And that fits with these conservative fiscal principles that many of my colleagues on the center-right side of the political spectrum have always consistently advocated. So it's educating them about that, it's engaging them, and then it's continuing with the follow-up. And there are times when we get discouraged, but when we continue to advance and advocate about how this is consistent with conservative principles, we tend to make progress.
Mark, at the beginning of this very interesting day, Virginia Barry talked about being at the White House in 1997, talking about these issues, and you looked at me with a certain amount of frustration and said, what do we do? What do we come away from this today that makes it different so that we're not still 30 years or 20 years ago?
It's amazing. I mean, you see an unbelievable science presentation where you see that the kids' brains are firing with this type of stimulation. You're going to hear from John Pepper, who ran a huge corporation, about it from a business perspective in a couple of minutes. You hear about it from the military. You know, so often politicians don't lead, and they really are waiting for the people to tell them what to do. And you see this across the country, that from the groundswell of, you know, I said to Koki, are we at a tipping point where in the next, you know, couple of years this might actually happen federally? Because you see it in Alabama. You see the biggest push coming in Alabama from the Chamber of Commerce. You see, you know, a groundswell of support across the country, and you see these statistics. James Heckman from the University of Chicago, which is not a liberal institution, who's a Nobel economic winner, saying that the ROI is somewhere around $7 for every dollar invested is $7 returned. So why isn't this happening? It's not happening because we aren't demanding it. And really the fault rests with us. And it's because we haven't demanded from our state leaders, our city leaders, our federal leaders, that we're not going to put up with it. I mean, you know, the statistic that stuns me, Koki, is that if my kid, you know, when our children were 4 years of age, is 18 months ahead of a kid that's living in poverty. And we are going to spend billions of dollars trying to remediate that gap, and in most cases, honestly, we're not going to do it.
Or we'll spend it on jail.
Yeah, well, yeah, you can talk to countless guys and women that are in public safety, and they'll tell you that they look at the reading scores, and the kids that aren't reading at grade level by the end of third grade, those are the number of prison beds they're going to build in the future. It's that clear, the connection. But for some reason or another, we just put up with this lack of a commitment from a federal level, and we just let it go. So that's why Save the Children Action Network was created. We want to hold people accountable. We don't want to just do the lobbying work and the education work, which is really important, but we want to say we're going to put money in the political process, just like, you know, the NRA does, just like AARP does. We sponsored conversation with the candidates 4 years ago. It was AARP did it, because we wanted to have questions asked of Governor Bush and Secretary Clinton and Martin O'Malley and Senator Rubio. We wanted to have them be asked these questions and be on the record, and then hear about it constantly from people over the course of the next few months. That's why we're sponsoring the debates that are sponsored by WMUR again in December and January, Republican and Democrat. Because look, there's going to be a divided Congress and a divided federal branch probably next year.
Well, certainly next year.
Well, yes, but I meant at the end of next year. The next Congress, it'll probably be divided, maybe, who knows? But the bottom line is Republicans are going to need help from the Democrats if we're going to push this forward, and vice versa. So we can't make this just a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. We really have to work.
Yeah, and just to add on that, you know, the changing dynamics of of advocacy, I think, are important. And I think Mark's group and so many of the groups that we've worked with recognize this. And it's no longer a top-down advocacy environment where, you know, like take the House, for example. I mean, chairmen just don't have the power to ram through legislation anymore. The same way folks in leadership don't have the same way in states, party leaders can't dictate who gets on and off the ballot. Instead, what we've seen is because of technology and because of the way because of the way advocacy organization works now, we're seeing the voices from the bottom up begin to be empowered again. And I think that's where everybody in this room and your ability to work with each other and really hold a lot of our policymakers accountable are the new real ace in the hole. And that, I think, is where that understanding of that dynamic and seeing so many of the organizations that are early childhood advocates recognizing that and bringing to life the voices around this country in support of it, it's really an important part of what we will eventually see as future success.
How do you also just get the parents involved? I mean, it was wonderful when Jackie was showing us the app and the 1,000 tips, but seems to me that that's the place where you can really, first of all, make a difference in the children's lives, but secondly, make a difference in terms of getting a groundswell going.
Well, just real quick on the app, if you haven't downloaded it, please do. It's an amazing tool to engage children with. My youngest son, Sean, has just turned 5, so I'm starting to lose the window of it here. But I use the app as and I talked earlier about a policy arms race, but you really do see how children become so engaged when you use the app or you use the tools that Vroom provides you to engage with your children. We were riding in the car one time, and I decided to use the car function. Actually, you can use the app in a way where you get to choose what setting you're working in, whether you're cooking at home or whether you're riding in a car. And when I started to engage Sean on the app where it's child as author, the child gets to tell a story based on questions that you tell him. My oldest boys, who are 7 and 9, they wanted to be part of it. They wanted to be part of this brain-building experience that we were engaging with Sean. And I think that
Also, he was getting all the attention.
That too. It was a 5-hour ride to Lake Chautauqua. But the great thing about the app is that it is what we see here is the science is indisputable. But I think oftentimes parents, when they hear science and math, like me, they get intimidated. I don't like science. I don't like math. But the app and so many of these the early childhood environments that we create, they make the parent feel empowered. The parent as scientist is the best thing about the Vroom app, and it's also the best thing about so many of these excellent early childhood education programs is that the parent feels empowered. And I think the more we go into these communities and tell parents that they should not be intimidated by this, that this is an empowering experience, I think that really does help the parents get more involved.
Koki, if I could just add, I mean, I think what Kevin just described was absolutely terrific. And I would just say that the parent being as the advocate, you got to do that on the political front as well.
That's what I meant.
And I think that, I was in the state legislature in Maryland for 8 years. If 2 tables just here show up in my office and talk to me about an issue, I'm going to pay attention. And I know New Hampshire has a lot of state reps.
Like most of the state.
Yeah, but just a few people can make a big difference. So sometimes I think we look around and we think, God, it's just me or my 5 best friends and I will go down. We don't want to go to the state legislature. We're not going to have an impact. Or why write a letter, or why make a phone call and get 5 other people to do it? If you get 5 or 10 or 15 people on a state rep or a city council, those politicians will listen to you because they're getting elected with just a few votes. And when it starts moving in a statewide or a citywide basis, the feds are going to pay attention to you. We were just involved out in Washington state in the Seattle ballot initiative that passed with an overwhelming majority to increase the property tax to invest it in early ed. Now King County, which is twice the size of Seattle, has a King County ballot initiative to increase dollars into early education. State of Washington just did a big increase in early ed. And I think that came about partly because of what happened in Seattle, partly because of the ongoing efforts in that state. You're seeing momentum in Washington state. What does that have to do with New Hampshire all the way across the country? You can see these examples of success, and they all start from the groundswell of a couple of committed people. There's that old Margaret Mead line. You probably know it much better than I do. I'll butcher it, but never doubt the power of a couple people to change the world. It's the only thing that ever does. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create an army of people that are educated on the science, that have listened to the business folks, that put these pieces together and working together demand accountability. But we need foot soldiers. And just the way you were educating your kids, we need foot soldiers to do that in the state legislative process, on the federal process, or even in the local process?
So I think you've got marching orders as foot soldiers. And I think Senator Shaheen will tell you that the same thing is true at the federal level. People are always amazed when I say to them that a constituent showing up with something that constituent cares about is more important than a funder showing up from outside of the state. And that is just universally the case. So it really does make a tremendous difference. Thank you both for your involvement and for convening us today, and we will continue this conversation.
Great to be here. Thanks to
Thank you
everybody.
very much. Thanks.